Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and I am here with my co-host, Mark Weaver, and we are joined today with Daring Greatly, and we have the family, Dale, Liam, and Patrick. Welcome.
Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us, Jim.
And today we're going to explore our first series that we're doing in the Exploring Reality section, and it's going to deal with the building blocks of reality. But before we jump into that, would you guys like to start us off with a song?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We would love to.
Right on.
Find a corner where I can hide. Silent footsteps crowding me. Sudden darkness, but I can see. No sugar tonight, my coffee. No sugar tonight, my tea. No sugar to stand beside me. No sugar to ride with me. Down, 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 down. In the silence of a mind, quiet movements where I can find, grabbing for me with her eyes. Now I'm falling from the sky. No sugar tonight, no coffee. No sugar tonight, my tea. No sugar to stand beside me. No sugar to ride with me. Down, 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 down,
was fantastic, guys. Thank you so much.
You're very
that,
welcome.
That really helps get everything rolling. We're definitely going to be talking about Mother Nature today, so apt song. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
All right. Well, as I mentioned, we're going to be starting a new series in the section of Kinship Cafe that we're calling Exploring Reality. And in Exploring Reality, we want to understand more about the nature of our universe and what it is, because as we're trying to understand well-being and how that relates, it's going to impact how our level of cohesion with what reality is versus what we believe is going to have a big impact on that. And we'll kind of touch on some of that as we go along the way. But this series is going to be called Building Blocks of Reality. So we're going to start really at the beginning, which you might think is something like the Big Bang or something like that, but we're going to start with ourselves because everything is about how it is perceived, right? Before anything else happens, we've got to wrestle with the fact that we've got certain filters and things that are in place that are impacting how we receive the information that's going on out there. For our starting off Building Blocks of Reality, our first episode, if you will, session 1, is going to be understanding your worldview. So to begin with, we're going to look at some questions. Well, what is a worldview? Very simply, it is seeing the world through a set of values and possibilities. So it is ascribing certain values to some things as opposed to others, and it is a certain set of possibilities, limits of how things can happen or what is possible. And that is essentially what a worldview is. The trick with a worldview is that it's not something that you choose. You're kind of born into it. And so you're going to have to, well, let me just put it this way. If you're not aware of the fact that you are born into a particular kind of worldview, then you don't know it's there. And that's a real challenge for us, right? Because if you don't know about it, then it's influencing you in ways that you might not be paying attention to. Let me give you an idea about how this works, because the process is what's called enculturation. It's what happens when you grow up or are born into a particular culture and you take it on, and there wasn't a specific task that you were trying to do, and not necessarily a task that people around you were trying to do for you to pick up the culture, but there is definitely ways that it happens. And one of the ways we could think about this is something very simple. Asking the question, how do you hold a fork? Now, this is a device that you use for eating, and there's probably lots of ways to get your food into your mouth. But if I was to ask you at the table, is there a right way to hold the fork? Who's got a pencil? You have one handy?
Yeah.
How do you hold a fork,
Well,
Mark?
of course, the way my mom said not to hold the fork was like this. No, it's like this. And I'm right-handed. It's like this.
Yes.
Right.
Right? Is this kind of what you would think as well?
Yes, sure.
And there was pain inflicted if you didn't hold it right in some families.
Yes.
Oh, we're getting to clash of worldviews. We're getting to that in just a moment.
Well, that's not even at the point of clash, right? This is at the point of creating or building, right? So if we think about the idea of how you hold a fork, it seems like a simple, small thing, right? You know, how do you hold a fork? But it is a million little things like that that make up a worldview and a culture. There's a value placed on how do you hold the fork. And how you know there's a value on it is how other people respond to you.
Right.
Because yes, your mother might have got you in big trouble if you didn't hold it right, but if you're out at a public restaurant and you hold it funny, you might, at least more so in days gone by, maybe not as much today, but you would probably get looks from people, right? Or you do certain kind of behaviors and somebody will ask you, like, what happened to you? Did you grow up in a barn? You know, I mean, all these kind of like social pressures from our parents to everybody else in public that are kind of helping to ingrain in you that this is the right way to do it.
You know, Jim, I was thinking about an additional example of this.
Okay.
This difference in worldviews that can show up for us. I remember when I was growing up, going to school down in San Diego, that on occasion I would see one of the Spanish-speaking kids in class being talked to by the teacher in the corner. And what it turned out that was all about was, why aren't you speaking up more in class? And what we know now is that young Latino kids, back then, I have to admit it was several decades ago, were brought up that you don't speak to adults. You do not respond in the way that I was acculturated to do in the family that I grew up in San Diego. So there was another example of a child that was brought up to follow some rules about how you interact with adults, and it was an interruption. It was a surprise to the teacher. In fact, the teacher thought the child was misbehaving in class by not participating. So another example in addition to how we're taught to eat at the table.
And this is a really good one, because when we encounter somebody that comes from a different context, a different cultural perspective, there's an unease that comes with that. And the reason for that is, when we take the time, not when we take the time, because we've gone through the process of becoming enculturated, there's a tremendous amount of information that we share that we don't have to explain. We just already know, right? I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but where the culture thing with somebody coming from a different culture creates some anxiety is because when somebody starts exhibiting behavior that's different than what we've been taught to value, we don't know what else is different, right? And that's where that anxiety comes in, when we start to encounter somebody who does things different or thinks things different, talks different, wears their pants or their hat a little different, you know. It's all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, well, what else do they do different? I don't know, because I no longer feel like I'm on the same page with them. That's one of the reasons why this enculturation process is so important. Because you might think, well, this is a bad thing, because as soon as you start to take on all these values and these habits that are kind of pre-reflective, pre-thinking, you know, just part of the nature of reality as you understand it, you might think that that's kind of a bad thing, but in reality, we need it. Because when we talk about communication, we can't say everything about anything, right? If I want to talk about my ride into work, where do I start, right? Do I have to explain what a car is? Do I need to explain what a road is? Do I need to explain where San Clemente is? Do I need to explain what an office is, right? I mean, there's just a ton of stuff that we just assume everybody else knows. It's kind of this unwritten social contract that allows communication to even be possible. Because when we think about words, which is how we're doing our communication, these are just squiggles on a page, right? Or sounds that we make in the air. They don't have any intrinsic meaning. How do they get that meaning? They get it because culturally we have assigned it meaning. So the meaning isn't even in the word itself, but in the larger context. And that may be the sentence or the phrase that's being uttered, but ultimately it's the entire, civilization that you are a part of that helps give it that meaning. And that all has to be there, or there's no communication. So we're not trying to say that worldviews are a bad thing. They're essential. But if we are unaware of them, they will have a very powerful influence over how we see the world, that if we don't take steps to understand what those impositions are, we won't be able to get past them, right? And this is how we're going to be able to actually engage with people from different cultural contexts or people coming from different perspectives.
You know, Jim, it occurs to me some of the other words that we've used to describe worldview is like our maps for the world, or our schema. Those of you that took psychology, you might remember that, or our conceptual understanding of the world. And in addition to running into that gap between maybe the way I was acculturated and brought up and that of someone else, the Latino kid in school, for instance, there's also the example of when our own worldview gets out of sync with an experience that we might have in the world. I think we're going to head in that direction to understand, since our goal here in this series of 9 video podcasts has to do with addressing how we can cultivate well-being, both at the individual, the community, the family level, an understanding of how this works at a personal level, just as you let us off, is critical for us to be able to continue to have this conversation about achieving well-being in the world.
Yeah.
So, clashing worldviews.
Let's not go there just yet.
What do you want to finish up
couple
first,
of
Jim?
pieces, yeah. There are a couple of things left in understanding worldview that we want to talk about. So when we say that it's this, we've taken on these values, it's important to understand that these values are also symbolized, right? So at one level, a flag is a piece of cloth. But on another level, you've got to be very careful what you do with it, right? Money is, I guess, technically also cloth that feels like paper, but it has a certain kind of value beyond what it is physically, right? This is a symbolic meaning that gets ascribed to these things that hold value. And then you have institutions that has the role of how do we perpetuate these symbols and these values, right? This is going to be the education system, it's going to be the banking system, it's going to be the government, it's going to be our parents, it's going to be each other. So we have to kind of understand how all these pieces work together. And then a couple of last parts that we want to just make sure that we're aware of here. There's a really interesting word called habitus. And this word is trying to explain what happens when there's this historical movement within a particular culture to adapt certain values, let me not say adapt, but adopt certain values that become so ingrained that it appears to be natural, right? It just is part of nature, even though it was completely a historical development within a particular cultural thing. This is something we have to be aware of, is that, you know, as we encounter things, there's going to be things that we think that are, this is just the way things are, but really, they're created, they're socially constructed. And that gets to kind of the final point I want to make sure that we talk about here, is that it is, we think of these as foundational. They're before explanation, they're before justification, they are precognitive, right? Those values exist for us before we really are thinking about them. And if you want to know what some of those are, just pretend to be an annoying child. And if somebody wants to talk about something, how do you hold a fork? Just ask the question, why? And don't stop, right? So why do we hold the fork like this? Well, we might say, because this is, you know, how my mom told me to hold the fork. Well, why? I don't know, right? But it's that way with a lot of things. So you could ask the question, why, about almost anything that you think is a part of reality, that is part of anything that has to do especially with value, of meaning. Ask the question why, and eventually you're going to hit that roadblock where all of a sudden there is no answer and you get upset because it's just the way things are, but you don't know why. That's when you know you've kind of hit those foundational values that are pre-justification, just because. And that's one of the things that we really want to make sure we pay attention to, especially since we've got some people from Canada here, and Canada's got some really crazy ideas, I think.
I would agree.
Just trying to lighten it up a little bit.
Sure.
You guys were taking this pretty serious.
We're just listening.
Well,
lots
good.
to soak in.
Lots to soak in. Are you tracking with me? Is this making
Absolutely.
sense?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. The government, for instance, is one of those things that everybody thinks is pre-conscious, but we live in our world doesn't include a government. We don't think that one's necessary, and not to bring up that point, but I'm saying there's a lot of people that couldn't imagine life without a government, and
Right.
every second we imagine one without a government. So
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, too, because it only takes one generation for things to be a certain way to make it seem like it's always been that way, when really it hasn't, right?
Mhm.
We might think about colors for babies. What color is blue? I mean, what color is the blue for in terms of boys or girls?
baby blue.
Boys.
Boys. And pink?
It's the girls.
right? Most people have that connection with them. Wasn't always that way. Not that long ago in this country, it was reversed. But growing up, never heard that. I didn't know that. It's just always been that way. And you just always have that connection. To think of it being reversed just feels weird. I mean, it's a simple thing. I mean, who cares really about those colors and how it relates to children? But somehow, that's one of those things that we've picked up as a value, as something that's assigned a certain meaning that has absolutely no basis in anything, but we all think we know what it is. It's just interesting, right? So, Mark, you were starting to bring up the question about when worldviews clash. So, I'm going to suggest there's a couple of things here that we want to look at. And it's the question first, does it pose a threat? Do you have some examples of when you might experience worldviews clashing? We've talked about somebody who's maybe talking or dressing differently. What might be some other examples?
Okay, well, out of a whole bunch that I can think of right now, where I'm coming from, as someone who I think I could describe my life's work as helping people to encounter their worldviews, understand them, and manage them. In the course of my work, which started off as a psychologist initially for 10 years working with combat veterans that returned to the United States after fighting not what we called a war, but was still a war in Vietnam. And the clash of worldviews that happened there was my experience over the course of 5 years of listening to these returned veterans, by definition, having great difficulty returning to the United States, in reconciling what it meant to be a warrior in our culture. Many of them returned through Oakland Airport and were spat upon. And some of you may have read the accounts of even medals being thrown into the trash. And in addition to that, the sense of dignity or self-respect also being trashed in the minds of these young veterans. What does this have to do with worldview? It has to do with the inherited worldview that was encoded in their minds and hearts about what it meant to be a warrior fighting for the United States and ostensibly freedom and democracy. And what happened in the course of that war was a deconstruction of those beliefs. Everything from understanding the Gulf of Tonkin incident on through the military-industrial complex, and all that had to do with realizing that compared to their World War II uncles and fathers and grandfathers, they came back with a very different self-estimation of what they had been. And so this was an example of an internal clash, of a worldview that no longer was effective. And the point I want to make here is our worldview is us. We cannot separate. The point you were making earlier about being coded and a priori. These are fancy psychologist words for mean we don't know the water that we're swimming in or the air that we're breathing. And it takes sometimes a very painful experience for this clash to show up.
Yeah.
So that would be one example that has to do more within an individual, in addition to the examples of encountering other cultures and ways in which we might clash with other cultures. But I think that we don't want to overlook how our own worldviews can go into a crisis
Sure.
and present a great deal of stress or distress and open a door for a shift, sometimes what's referred to as a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's probably worth noting that there's different levels of worldviews. So there's one that we kind of have inherited as being part of the modern Western world mindset, right? The certain values of autonomy in particular is a key value in the Western world. But there's subsets that we're also a part of within that. And those could be religious affiliations, they could be ethnic affiliations, they could be certain types of organizations that you belong with, like the military, that each have their subsets of kind of worldview ideas as well, right? So yeah, there's lots of different ways that we can come into how do we bump up against these things. So what happens, again, does it pose a threat? So if it's significant enough, like what was happening with the vets who were returning that had to really reevaluate what they thought they were doing and how it was being perceived by the public, at least the ones that were they were interfacing with. They had to know what to do with that. And there's really basically three different things that we can do when we come across a worldview that is different than ours. One is we can ignore it. And this is kind of a way of saying that we can just simply dismiss it, right? Well, that one doesn't matter. Those people are uneducated. Those beliefs are, unenlightened, or they don't have faith, or whatever. Some way that we can easily dismiss it so that we don't have to pay attention to what those differences are. The other thing that can happen is we can deplore it, right? Now, this is where it gets a little bit more of a danger. If this worldview that we're come across challenges what we believe in a serious way, then we have to up the ante in terms of how we defend our worldview against it. And this is where people start to get defensive. This is where they start to draw the lines. They work to dehumanize the other person or the other beliefs in order to justify why we're not going to participate. Or it could be that there's strong lines drawn in terms of association or having contact or reading their material, right? So you might see some of this where you have more fundamentalist types of religious situations where they're very concerned about coming in contact with other kinds of beliefs. One of the things that's been more in the public eye on a couple of things along these lines that we can see is one that's happened for quite some time in this country, is the question about evolution versus creationism, right? And so they are very, for some of the creationists, they're very concerned about their children being exposed to discussions about evolution. And that would be an example of how they are deploring it. They're trying to fight against it. They don't want their children to come in contact with it because of the threat that it creates, right? Then there's another side of this, and this is the idea that we could choose to explore. So we got ignore, deplore, or explore. Tried to come up with something that kind of rhymed here.
Good job.
Well, thank you. So the exploring part of it is maybe there's something to this, and we're going to check into it further, right? But there's got to be a reason why we're willing to do that. And Mark brought up a couple of them already. One is there could be a significant enough kind of a crisis that it's not working. What we thought we believed and understood about the world has failed us, and therefore we need to be open to different possibilities, was probably the number one reason why that happens. And so we might talk about this as updating our worldview. And again, number one reason that this is going to happen is because there was a crisis, or that the worldview that we currently hold is no longer adequate. Did you have any thoughts?
I was
along
thinking
those
about
lines?
that word crisis last night and went and looked it up. It's from the Greek. It actually comes from the word to decide. And think about it. Decide infers that there's an action to be taken. And this idea that we come to a point where there's some sort of a gap between our actual experience and our understanding of ourselves or the world or another person or another culture. I'm sitting here thinking about our audience and what they're going to take away from this. And one thing I like to do sometimes is to boil something down into a simple phrase. And I remember the first time I saw this phrase, it stuck with me, and it just so applies to what we're talking about here today. And that phrase was as getting on a train or a trolley in another country, seeing the sign, mind the gap. Mind the gap. So out of all of these high-flying concepts, and the great job that you very professorially take us through in understanding these building blocks last week around how it is we know what we know. Today we're talking about these mental constructs and the ways that we operate in the world, and how do we update our maps, and how does crises help us or encourage us to do that. That what this is about is that we all need to realize that we're not experiencing reality directly. That it's always, I love Alvin Toffler's quote on this, by the way, and it was that every person carries in his head or her head a mental model of the world, a subjective representation of external reality. Mind the gap, folks. It never fully captures and is always evolving. I'm starting to get ahead of us now, but I guess what I'm wanting to say here is, what this is about is really on the ground in our lives, how this business about cognitive schemas and worldviews, well, why should we be concerned about this at all? And I submit to you that minding the gap is the key message to take away here. And what we're about here is not only doing these intellectual exercises, but we're going to be having some sessions where we're going to be doing some activities to apply these principles in real dialogue and exploring how this actually works on the ground in our worlds together. So, mind the gap.
I like
Joe,
it.
mind the gap. Yeah.
Dale?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're always looking for opportunities for growth in everything. We're looking for those opportunities, and one of the things that continues to reoccur is holding your existing thoughts and beliefs under great scrutiny, and under the premise, based on the information I have today, this is what I believe, and so there's no attachment to any existing thought or belief. Because especially now, we have this winding up of information and consciousness and energy and all of these forces coming in, these new generations bringing a whole new thought process. To be able to keep up in that kind of dynamic environment, we absolutely have to be in that humble place, so that there is no attachment whatsoever to any existing thoughts and beliefs. It's just, the caveat is always, based on the information I have today, this is what I believe, but please feed me new information if I don't have it.
Yeah.
I'm hungry for that. That's where growth lives.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of place that we like to be in.
And so well put, because, I like to talk about things that are alive grow. Things that are dead don't, right? And unfortunately, we have this great desire for security, for confidence, for certainty, right? We want to know. And so we try to hold on to things that give us those kinds of values. But when we do, it prevents us from being influenced or growing or learning. And so we have to develop that humility, like you said, about what we know, because if we don't, then we're setting ourselves up for disaster, right? And it actually leads very well into this next point, which is we can also intentionally choose to question our worldview. And that's part of what I'm hoping we can do with this series, is in a safe place, really work to ask some of those questions, to get back to that first thing where you don't have a reason for it, and explore it, right? And see, does it make sense? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And where are we at now? What do we know at the moment? Like you said, it's constantly changing and it's evolving, but it's not evolving in such a way that it completely does away with everything before it, usually. There's some part of it that usually is applicable still at some level, but it's growing. It's building on top of things that we have learned and continuing to improve and gain in that knowledge. And then we also need to be aware of the fact that there is pressure to conform, especially to the existing worldview. And it's partly because, like we talked about, that desire for certainty, for things to be right, to know that this is the truth. And if somebody steps outside of that, goes beyond, then there's usually a great deal of social pressure to get them to conform back. It's kind of like somebody, who was an alcoholic, let's say, and that all their friends were alcoholics, and they decide that they're going to get sober. Their friends don't like that, do they? Right? I mean, they're trying to get them to come back to the old way of life because their being sober is a challenge to the rest of them about where they are at. What is their level of addiction or being out of control and not being present? And so there's a lot of pressure to change, and we have to be aware that there's going to be those kinds of pressures. If we step outside the box, if we're willing to explore and to change, we've got to also be prepared that there's going to be this kind of pressure that we're going to have to also confront and deal with.
That point actually relates really well to the music industry and art really in general. But in our experiences, corporate record labels are what drives the whole music industry and radio. And yeah, that's just something that we don't want to be a part of. So we're writing music and creating businesses to stay outside of that. And we get lots of outside pressure from listeners, from business people who want to give us advice to reach the next step in our career, because they have some assumption of, you know, our idea of success and their idea are just very different. So yeah, the music industry relates very well to that.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things I really love about you guys is how much you're outside of the box, but really not just in word, but in deed, that you are actually living out your title, daring greatly to try and achieve something different, right? And I love the fact that you use that title from that speech when we had that other interview and you brought that up. It's just such a great concept, right? And that's what's needed to have that living, growing way of life, that life of change, right? Challenge.
Absolutely. No, I'm sorry. Well, the pressure from the industry was, they told us to change that name. It's not a rock and roll name.
Really?
Yeah, somebody from Leonard Skinner actually told us that in Nashville when we were recording in Nashville, and we had lots of other great names that we were considering changing it to because that was Leonard Skinner. We were supposed to listen, and our drummer Braden, he slammed his fist down one day and he said, "No, bugger those guys. We're daring greatly."
Yeah.
And that was it. No more conversation. That was it.
Nice. Good job, Braden.
Jim, I wanted to add that,
Yeah.
that this also applies to some of the really big questions of our time in history right now. I mean, as an example of taking a lot of heat for daring to think differently, I mean, you know, just think about Copernicus being so daring to suggest that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, and the consequences of that whole revolution. So one of the things as well that I want to mention that I'm appreciating about Daring Greatly, and Veronica last week, who was part of our conversation here, is the energy, the emotion that music brings to the table that's so distinctly beyond what we can do with words, talking about concepts on a slideshow here, right? And how instantly you transported me back to the 60s. Yes, I can remember those concerts. That was Buffalo Springfield, right? Am I?
Guess Who.
Guess Who? Yeah,
Yeah.
good Canadian band.
Okay, thank you. I
Yeah.
should have known. Apologies, but the point about worldviews that I wanted to bring back into the picture here is that it is about much more than just our conscious ability to language and label things, but there's a whole ethos and feeling. And I just really appreciate you guys being willing to sit at the table and be a part of a conversation here, as well as sharing your music with us and setting that context for me as I was sitting here thinking, okay, what are we doing here? We're doing this wild thing to try and talk about well-being, and we're going to talk about mental constructs, and you know, how do we achieve highest well-being in the world. And I like having the artistry, the creativity, that representation at the table, and I'm just thanking you guys for being willing to be a part of that.
No, absolutely. We love that. We actually call it the artistry of life, and these conversations are absolutely important, because if we weren't having these conversations, if we weren't asking these questions, then we would be signed to a major record label, and we would be part of the industry, and we'd be wondering where the meaning went, and why we're not happy, and why when we dreamed this dream and it came true, why isn't it fulfilling us? We would be wondering those things if we went down that path. So it's great that we've had these conversations since the boys were really, really young. And they started asking great questions, like, why do we pay for our food? Well, I don't know how to answer that question intelligently as a parent. And so I say, well, let's explore that. And what are the alternatives if we don't pay for our food? Then what other options do we have? And do those models exist? And if they don't, can we build them? And now every aspect of life, they're asking the questions all the time. The beautiful mind of the 20-year-old is the most inspiring thing I've ever come across in the last 30 years, is since I was one, I guess. But just great questions. Lots of whys, like you said, Jim, and there's a lot of whys that haven't been answered in decades. Lots of them.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue into our final part that we want to talk about tonight, and that is the need for coherence. And that is between what we believe about the world and what actually is in the world. And I'm going to give just a couple of examples, somewhat historical, for where these things come into play. If we think about something like physical injury and disease, there was a time where these were explained as a punishment for sin, right? So if that is why somebody is currently sick, or their hand is going numb, or they're having seizures or something like that, then of course the solution is to appease the gods, to pray, to whatever it is, right? But the more we've come to understand, that's not really what's going on. We have a much better model for understanding why that person's hand went numb, or why they're having a seizure, or what's going on with this disease, and we've got a way to treat it, right? So the better we've got a coherence between our understanding and belief about what's going on and what's actually there, the more we're going to actually be able to engage in ways that make a difference, because it will be operating within the context of what's actually there, right? So another thing we could look at is the same thing with mental health, right? How often was that confused as being possessed by demons? And how effective was that treatment versus what we're able to do today? We can think about things like public policy. We've got lots of questions today about something called climate change, right? And some serious debate on this whole thing and different sides of it. How do we sort through this? How do we try to understand more accurately what reality is when we're thinking about how we believe in the world and how that's going to impact things like policy? The other thing is, or how we start to think about this then, is we have to be aware that the worldview exists in order for us to examine it, to find out if we need to make some changes. And so that's kind of what we need to start with here with this talk, with the question about worldview and perception. Where we're going to go from here is, now that we've got kind of a sense of how worldviews color the world, gives us kind of a tinted glasses that we see things through, we're going to step back then, and in the rest of this series, the building blocks of reality, we're going to start with, what do we know right now? You said we want to be constantly ready to be updated, so this is provisional. It's what we know now, and to be updated as we go along the way. But we want to start literally from the beginning. Big bang. What do we know about the foundation of this universe and how it operates, and how did we get from point A to point B? Because the more we have a clear understanding of what that is, then that'll help to us to evaluate our worldviews and how well do they match up with what we're able to understand. And again, one of the key criteria that we're looking at for how we answer these questions, Mark, this was the phrase that we used with our first episode. What was that phrase?
You're going to tell me right now, Jim, because I can't remember it right now.
Consensually validatable information. Right? It's, if I've got an idea about something, or I've got a hypothesis about something, I'm going to test it, I'm going to see how it works out, and I'm going to update my evaluation of that hypothesis based off of how that experiment goes. But it's not just me. I need to make sure Dale can do the same thing. If for some reason I'm coming up with these wild estimates on something that Dale's like, I don't know how you're getting these, Jim, then we've got to figure something out. Something's not right. And the more we can get consensually validatable information, then we know we're working at getting around this problem of worldview. We're getting around this problem of how our brains are wired and all these kind of predispositions that we have to overcome. Like we talked about last week, if we just went with our senses, we would be convinced that the world was flat and that the sun and moon rise and set. We know that's not the case, right? Only reason we know that is not because of our senses, but because we were able to get around it, and we were able to develop ways of testing and measuring and checking that other people could validate, right? So that's why we're kind of starting at the beginning, and we're going to move through. But I want to stress that we're going to do this at a very conversational level. We're not going to dive into physics and chemistry at a level that's going to put you to sleep. And Mark's going to work hard to prevent that from happening. He's going to hold my feet to the fire to say, okay, Jim, why does this matter? Right?
That's partly what I'm here for, exactly. Right.
So I just want to kind of set the stage for where we're going from here. And at this point, I just kind of want to hear some more from you guys about what do you think about this topic that we had tonight, worldviews.
I wonder if any of you guys had something that you were wanting to say earlier that you didn't get a chance to say yet, putting you on the spot. But, Liam?
I guess as far as worldviews, I guess I was going to say that it was quite the process to come from a big city like Calgary in Canada that was very educational based, and then moving into a career based so that you could feed, like it was a classic middle class worldview that Dale was a huge part of. So I just think it's pretty cool that Dale's on this journey with us right now, because he was already submerged in 45 years of worldviews, which I think would make it harder to question them and to go in a different direction, whereas us 20-year-olds have questioned it from the beginning.
Right.
So we kind of have a step up on jumping on tour and going in a bus and not having a real job and escaping the real world, or what people call the real world, whereas Dale had to completely say, like, although everyone around me says that at my age I should be thinking about my retirement and about settling down and making sure I have enough money set and enough food stored so that I can survive the rest of my life. Like, I think, the whole worldview changing, Dale had a lot of clashes, I'm sure. Well, and him being our parent and literally teaching us all of those values for our first 10 years of our relationship, I guess, just because we were so submersed in that reality. A lot of the things that he taught us and that we got untaught, we untaught them together, as a parent and a kid. That was a pretty interesting experience.
I wanted to punctuate something that you said earlier, Dale, about holding our beliefs or our thoughts lightly and being open. I'm hearing how you've transmitted this to your kids. What a great job. Mm-hmm. And I love this quote from a book called Naming the Elephant: Worldview as a Concept. This guy's name is James Sire. And his quote is this: "For any of us to be fully conscious intellectually, we should not only be able to detect the worldviews of others, but also be aware of our own," and here it comes, "and why ours is as it is, and why do we choose it in the light of so many options that are out there." I think that is really powerful for us. By the way, I was noticing earlier when you even brought up the piece about, I've made the association to meditation because you were talking about holding thoughts lightly, and then I was thinking about in San Diego when it was first introduced to try and bring mindfulness into the classroom. The clash of worldviews was, oh my God, no, not that Eastern communist religion, right? Because it was associated with, this map that people had about what meditation was supposed to be about. This isn't an American thing. I hope that we've evolved beyond that at this point, but there's another good example of that knee-jerk reaction that we can have. And something that we're going to go more into, kind of preview of coming attractions, is that dynamic of fear that's underneath that. Fear is huge in this whole business, right? Fear is what constricts. We either go into chaos or we go into rigidity. It's a good indicator when the map for our experience of reality is off, when we experience that fear. And I look forward, Jim, and going further, as we're going to go into a whole bunch of stuff having to do with making some of this science, bring it into more of a conversational level to understand what the latest brain research has to say to us about how to hold those schemas, those conceptual maps lightly, how to manage the fear, especially at a time right now when, indeed, for the first time in the measured history of measuring stress in the United States, over 45 years, the fear of what's going on politically in this country for the first time exceeds the fear about money in the minds of typical Americans. That should tell you something about a tipping point that we may be getting to. And I look forward to talking about these dynamics of how managing these these worldviews and our fear. And as we stated last week, our goal is to create a setting for civil discourse, reduce dogma, hold our beliefs lightly, and explore the frontiers of how we can cultivate and increase well-being at so many different levels. So anyway.
Yeah. At this point, does anybody in our studio audience have some questions or comments about what we're talking about?
Learned that growing up, I had like a lot of sensory issues. Like I just didn't like touch things, or I had sensitivity to sounds, just tactile difficulties. And when my son was born, and shortly thereafter, I noticed a lot of things in him. Found out he was diagnosed autistic, and then found out that I was autistic.
Mm-hmm.
I got diagnosed, and then it changed my worldview, and it changed. Okay, so that's why these things happen, and it makes me more appreciate who I am. Like, this is who I am. That's my neurology. I accept it.
Yes.
I'm not ashamed to say I'm autistic. That's who I am. That's the way my brain works, and it's affected how I interact with people. And I'm like, okay, I don't have to justify or explain myself to other people. It's
Yes.
just the way I design. It's just the way I am.
Yes.
Accept me for take it or leave it. This is who I am.
What a great example of being able to plug into some consensually developed knowledge about this condition actually, what we're now starting to redefine as neurodiversity, ADD and the autistic spectrum. And thank you for being willing to share that here with us about how that shifted the way that you regarded yourself, probably makes you an even more effective father for your son. And here you are sharing with us and having an impact.
Yeah. Happier now than I was when I was younger.
Ah, wonderful. Thank you very much.
And I think that's reminds me of something else that's important when we're thinking about how these worldviews and these cultures are maintained in terms of that institutional aspect. It tends to be fairly inflexible about that diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Our education system tends to focus on one style of learning, and even without going to larger extremes, there's a lot of diversity even within what would be considered with the standard range. I'm not sure what the terms are for those. I don't want to say normal, because we're understanding that normal...
Well, we're redefining it. As a matter of fact, do you know that as we speak, that Microsoft is actively recruiting, among other enlightened companies? I wouldn't say Microsoft is enlightened in every way, but in this regard, enlightened in that they're recruiting for people on the spectrum. And they put them into very carefully constructed working environments to elicit this super performer level of capacity that comes out of people who are neurodiverse, not suffering a disorder, but we're recognizing and adapting a worldview here that we need to incorporate this diversity. Anyway, another example of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They should have done that with artists 50 years ago.
Absolutely.
But so there's a lot of cognitive dissonance when we start talking about not having that cohesion. And my own father and I don't talk because I brought up the concept that we should grow our own food so that we can take back our health and our power. And that doesn't fit into his model, and he's not willing to let go of that under any circumstances whatsoever. And he would rather not talk to his own child for the rest of his life than let go of that belief. So I learned that lesson pretty well because of that, and because that's obviously not, there's no growth there, and I know how closely I'm being watched by these guys and vice versa, and we're trying to learn from each other and create that environment of growth. But that's the price that some people are willing to pay. A lot of people are willing to pay. Even on, I find it amusing in a sad kind of way, that there's single people out there that would literally say, and don't ask me out on a date if you're a conservative, or don't ask me out on a date if you're a Democrat. And it's like, it's hard enough. Why would you want to eliminate the other 50% of that whole demographic? Like, why wouldn't you want to talk about it? Why wouldn't you want to open yourself up to maybe some other perspectives? I mean, how could you be that close-minded about this is the way it is and there's no other way? There's some other powers and some other energies going on that are keeping people that convicted in their thoughts, and therefore convicted in their static existing reality that doesn't allow them to grow outside of that because of that rigidity in their thinking.
I just want to speak to that for a minute, because I talk about this a lot, the problem that people have in talking with each other today, right? Especially when they disagree on things. And we talk about, the lack of civil discourse anymore. I am convinced that part of what is behind that is our sense of meaning and purpose about what life is about has been challenged by those why questions, right? Because we've become so diverse of a population that it's not just everybody's one way, and it brought up the question, well, why is it that way? Why are we saying this is what that purpose and that meaning is? And as a consequence, the traditional answers to those questions that have sustained us have kind of failed to give us that answer to the degree that we would like, but nothing else has really risen to fill that void. And so it's left us with kind of this sense of anxiety about, what should I be doing? What is this all about? And I'm not sure, but I'm very afraid of what you're talking about. And when that fear comes in, people dig in their heels, they draw the line in the sand, and they don't hear. They just start becoming defensive. And when you move into that frame of mind, you don't even process the information. You can probably speak to that in more detail.
That's that fear response of the brain. And we're going to be getting into actually some actual techniques for managing this. What you're talking about in part is polarized thinking. It's one or the other. And in fact, there's quite a bit of really fascinating research and actual applications of this research for how to bridge polarized thinking and creating avenues for dialogue and discovering third alternatives to approaches to these problems. That's where we're headed, Jim. We want to apply these principles in some ways in our lives, and I look forward to getting to... In fact, Jim, would you summarize for our audience the difference between the Exploring Reality sessions, and then we're going to be having the other sessions, which we are calling...
Life Practices.
Yeah, well, tell us about that.
So we'll be working every other week, roughly. Essentially the first and third Thursdays of the month, we will have our Exploring Reality series, which currently is the one that will be on the building blocks of reality. And then on the alternating weeks, we'll have life practices, where we are learning actual techniques, like you said, about how do we put these things into practice. And if we're talking about how do we cope with things like anxiety, or learn how to open our minds to be more receptive to seeing other possibilities, these are some things that you can learn how to do. Right? And so we definitely want to work at putting those into practice as well, not just simply intellectual exercise.
Very good.
We have had quite the conversation tonight.
We have had quite the conversation, and thanks to you guys for enriching it.
Yeah,
Very welcome.
Our pleasure, yeah. I'd like to say one more thing. I've
Sure.
been having some fun writing about challenging all of these concepts, and again, where the growth lives and where the answers are, and it's changing the process is always, it's never about the decision, it's never about the outcome, it's about always changing the process or improving the process and looking at the process of how did we come to that conclusion, and that always seems to be a lot more helpful, just taking one step above the actual problem or the question or the content or the conclusion or anything, and going to the process and making sure that there's no flaws in the process in coming to that conclusion. And that's been a lot of fun exploring and experimenting with, because it always almost invariable gets me to a way better understanding of the conclusion. And if something is questioned about the conclusion, I immediately can go back to the process in which I concluded that and use that as some information to bring context to the conversation, so that it ends up being a lot of fun having these kind of exchanges.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to having more with you guys too, because I am all about where you guys are headed. Speaking of that, would you guys like to close us out with another song?
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got one more. We'll play an original tune here for you guys. This one's called Save You From. It was largely a collaborative effort between me and our drummer, Braden Terrio, when we were best friends living in opposite cities, pursuing opposite. He was an engineer in school, and I was pursuing a career in hockey as an athlete. Both things we thought we loved, but we're struggling in that moment with why we actually loved it, and were we actually domesticated into loving it. Turns out we were, and music was that perfect bridge for the two of us to connect. So we wrote the song over FaceTime, and he wrote the lyrics, I wrote the music, and it's pretty much the title of the track is called Save You From, and we're hoping, our saving us from our questioning life and all this, I guess anxiety you can call it, was music for us. So Save You From. Here it is.
Great. Thank you.
This life wasn't cut for you. Fused and broken. This life has lost you. You say it's hard coming back. Going with you, even when the nights are darker and the stars fall so far away. Oh, I believe in you. Yeah, you tonight, I will save you from. Spend your time just trying to reason with yourself. I know the feelings got you stumbling over fears. Yeah, but never no, being almost just is something that you can't breathe. See the truth and drink the juice and all the lies. Silent tragedy.
Thank you guys so much for another awesome song. That was fantastic. I want to thank Mark for being co-host, Darren Greatly for being our musical guest and conversational partner today, and thank you to our studio audience. If you like what we are doing, we need your help. We are doing this up on Patreon, what allows you to be partners with us and helping make this a reality. We have a very simple model. If you would like to be a supporting member, it's only $7 a month. And we'd love to see you be a part of that team to help us create this safe place to really work with these questions and help to support people when they get that pressure from the outside, wanting them to conform. Let us help to show that there's other people out there who are thinking about these things and really working to elevate our level of thinking. So that's patreon.com/kinship_cafe. Thank you guys again so much, and thank you.
Thank you.
All right.